the magician, and the miracle. Imagine this. Picture yourself walking through the front doors of your local bank on an ordinary Tuesday morning. You've spent 3 decades of your life working hard, maybe as a physician, saving lives, an educator shaping young minds, or perhaps waiting tables in cities like Detroit or Dubai, sending every spare dollar back to your homeland so you could one day retire in peace. You approach the ATM, enter your PIN, and check your account balance. The screen displays a number that makes you breathe easier. $200,000. You can see those digits clearly. You feel the security that number represents, the years of sacrifice it took to build that nest egg. You walk to the counter and make a simple request to the bank teller. I need to withdraw $500, please. I have groceries to buy and rent to pay. The teller looks up at you with eyes that carry a mixture of exhaustion and sadness, then delivers words that don't make sense. I'm very sorry, but the most I can give you today is $50. And here's where it gets even stranger. That $50 isn't even in the currency you deposited, it's in the local money. By the time you leave the bank and reach the supermarket down the street, the purchasing power of that cash in your hand has already declined by another 10%. This isn't science fiction. This isn't some nightmare scenario from a dystopian novel. This is the daily reality for millions of ordinary people living in Lebanon right now. We're not discussing a standard economic recession here. We're not talking about a temporary downturn in the business cycle. According to analysis from the World Bank, what happened in Lebanon ranks among the 3 most catastrophic economic implosions recorded since the middle of the 19th century. We're examining a nation where roughly $70 billion belonging to regular depositors simply vanished into thin air. This is a story about a central bank governor who was celebrated internationally as a financial genius and wizard. It's about political leaders who treated the national treasury as if it were their personal checking account. And it's about a financial system that, when you strip away the polite language and call things by their real names, functioned as arguably the largest Ponzi scheme in record of human history. Bernie Madoff? Its fraud involved $65 billion, which now seems almost modest by comparison. In Lebanon, the scammer wasn't a single criminal. The scammer was the state itself, the entire system. Welcome to the unvarnished truth about Lebanon's economic catastrophe. Prepare yourself, because this story descends into some very dark territory. To comprehend how a country can crash this spectacularly, you first need to understand how high it appeared to be flying, or at least how high everyone believed it was flying. Let's turn the clock back to the early 1990s. The Lebanese Civil War finally ended in 1990. After 15 brutal years, the country lay in absolute ruins. Nearly every building bore the scars of bullet holes. The infrastructure had been obliterated, but the Lebanese people have always been remarkably resilient. They call their nation the Phoenix because it always seems to rise again from the ashes of destruction. Leading this national resurrection was a billionaire business tycoon named Rafik Hariri, who became the prime minister. Working alongside him as his financial right-hand man was Riad Salameh. Remember that name carefully, Riad Salameh. In 1993, Salameh assumed the position of governor of Banque du Liban, which is Lebanon's central bank, abbreviated as BDL. He certainly looked the part of a distinguished central banker. He smoked expensive cigars, wore impeccably tailored suits, and carried himself with a calm, confident demeanor. Salameh arrived with a clear vision for the country's future. He wanted to stabilize Lebanon by first stabilizing its currency, the Lebanese lira. So in 1997, Salameh made a decision that would define the next 22 years of Lebanese economic life. He pegged the Lebanese lira to the United States dollar. At a fixed rate, 1,500 lira equals $1. That simple equation became as reliable and constant as the law of gravity. For more than 2 decades, that exchange rate held firm. It didn't waver when Lebanon fought a devastating war with Israel in 2006. It didn't budge through multiple political assassinations. It remained stable even though the government failed to pass an actual budget for 12 consecutive years, which is a true fact, as bizarre as that sounds. You could walk into any shop in Beirut carrying a crisp $100 bill, purchase a pack of chewing gum, and receive your change in lira, calculated at exactly the 1,500 rate. Students could pay their university tuition in either lira or dollars. The 2 currencies were completely unchangeable. This remarkable stability created a powerful illusion of incredible prosperity throughout the country. Beirut reclaimed its historical reputation as the Paris of the Middle East. The streets filled with luxury automobiles. Rooftop bars opened on every corner of fashionable neighborhoods. Cocktails cost $20 each. Real estate prices climbed to levels that rivaled property values in London or New York City. The banking sector transformed into the crown jewel of the entire Lebanese economy. Banks in Lebanon weren't functioning like normal banks. They operated more like powerful vacuum cleaners, sucking in capital from around the world. They offered interest rates that seemed absolutely insane by international standards. I'm talking about 5%, 7%, and eventually 10% annual interest on dollar deposits. Think about that for just a moment. In the United States or Europe during the period after the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates were hovering near zero. If you were lucky, you might earn 0.25 to 0.5% on your savings account. But in Lebanon, if you deposited $1 million in a Beirut bank, you could literally sit on the beach sipping cocktails and earn $70,000 per year in completely passive income, doing absolutely nothing. Where was all this money actually coming from? The answer lies with the Lebanese diaspora, the millions of Lebanese people living outside Lebanese borders. There are actually more Lebanese people living abroad than inside the country itself. They're spread across Brazil, West Africa, the United States, and the Gulf Arab states. They work extremely hard in these countries, and they send money back home to their families. Salameh and the banking sector delivered a simple, compelling message to the diaspora. Bring your US dollars here to Lebanon. Your money is completely safe. The lira is pegged to the dollar and cannot move. And we will pay you interest rates that are far better than anything Wall Street can offer. And this strategy worked brilliantly. Oh boy, did it ever work. Billions of dollars came flooding into Lebanon. The banks were absolutely flushed with cash. They used that incoming cash to purchase government debt in the form of Eurobonds, and they deposited the rest of it at the central bank, which in turn paid the commercial banks even higher interest rates than the banks were paying to depositors. It seemed like everyone was happy in this arrangement. First, the government was happy because the banks kept lending them unlimited money to fund their corruption schemes, their patronage networks, and their bloated public sector salaries, all without ever needing to implement any actual reforms. Second, the banks were happy because they were recording record-breaking profits by lending to both the government and the central bank. Third, ordinary people were happy, or at least distracted from problems, because their savings accounts were growing steadily. The lira remained stable, and they could afford to buy imported iPhones and German luxury cars. Fourth, the international community was happy and impressed. Riad Salameh was winning prestigious international awards. Euromoney magazine named him Central Bank Governor of the Year. He even rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Salameh was a big deal. What do you say about that governor? He was treated like a magician who had solved impossible problems. But here's where I need to inject some harsh reality and burst this beautiful bubble. In economics, there exists a concept called the impossible trinity, or the trilemma. It states that you cannot simultaneously have all three of the following: a fixed exchange rate, free movement of capital across borders, and an independent monetary policy. You can only pick two. Salameh was attempting to defy this fundamental economic law and ignore gravity itself. More importantly, there's a basic principle of banking you need to understand. When a bank pays you interest on your deposit, it's because that bank is investing your money in a productive business that generates actual profit. If I lend you $100 and you use it to start a lemonade stand, you eventually pay me back $105 from the revenue you earn selling lemonade. That extra $5 is real profit generated by real economic activity. But the Lebanese banks weren't investing depositor money in lemonade stands. They weren't financing factories or technology startups or agricultural projects. They weren't funding any productive economic activity whatsoever. They were lending money almost exclusively to the Lebanese state, the government. And the Lebanese state produces virtually nothing of economic value. It exports almost nothing to the world. It runs a massive trade deficit year after year. It purchases fuel, medicine, and food using US dollars, but it collects tax revenue in the depreciating lira. The state was essentially a black hole of corruption and waste. So the banks were taking your hard-earned dollars, handing them over to the government, which immediately wasted them on kickbacks and payments to ghost employees who didn't actually work. And then the banks were paying you attractive interest using, wait for it, the new deposits coming in from the next person who walked through the door. Does that pattern sound familiar to you? It's the textbook classic definition of a Ponzi scheme. As long as fresh money keeps flowing into the system for new investors, the old investors continue to get paid, and the party keeps going. Everyone seems happy. The exchange rate peg of 1,500 lira to the dollar was the glue holding this massive lie together. It convinced everyone that the Lebanese lira was just as good and reliable as the United States dollar. But by 2011, the neighborhood started getting dangerous. The civil war in neighboring Syria erupted just across the border. Tourism to Lebanon dried up almost completely. The wealthy Gulf Arab countries became increasingly annoyed with Lebanon's political situation, specifically the growing influence of Hezbollah, and they slowed down their investments in Lebanon dramatically. The flow of fresh US dollars into the country started to slow down to a trickle. The magician Riad Salameh looked at his balance sheet at the central bank and realized that the stream of fresh cash was stopping. The Ponzi scheme was beginning to wobble and show cracks. Most responsible central bankers around the world would have devalued the currency at that point. Yes, it would have been painful. The country would probably have experienced a recession, but it would have been manageable. Salameh didn't choose that path. Instead, he decided to double down on his bets. He decided to go all in with a financial maneuver that would eventually detonate and destroy the entire country. He called this strategy financial engineering. It's a deliberately boring technical name for what was essentially a financial suicide pact. 2. The financial engineering trap. The year is 2016. The Syrian civil war is raging violently just across Lebanon's eastern border. Tourists have completely disappeared from the country. The Gulf states have effectively closed the money tap. Lebanon's balance of payments, which is basically the country's checking account with the rest of the world, is deep in the red. US dollars are leaving Lebanon much faster than they're coming in. For any normal country, this is the moment when you pump the brakes hard. You devalue your currency to reflect reality. You cut government spending dramatically. You admit to your citizens that the country is broke and needs to make sacrifices. You take your medicine, as painful as it might be. But Riad Salameh, the celebrated magician, decided instead to try to levitate the Titanic while it was already taking on water. He launched what he officially termed financial engineering. Now, here's an important rule to remember. Whenever a banker uses a vague, boring, technical term like engineering or structuring, you should immediately hold on to your wallet tightly. It usually means they're doing something incredibly risky and dangerous with your money, while trying to hide it behind complicated language. Here's how this financial witchcraft actually works. It gets a bit technical, but please stay with me because this is the smoking gun. This is the precise mechanism through which the robbery occurred. The central bank, BDL, was rapidly running out of foreign reserves, meaning the US dollars it needed to defend that sacred 1,500 lira peg we discussed earlier. They needed a fresh injection of US dollars, and they needed it desperately and fast. The commercial banks, where you and your father and your cousin had deposited your life savings, had US dollars in their vaults, but they were sitting on them cautiously. So Salameh crafted an offer that the banks couldn't possibly refuse. He essentially said to them, "Give me your US dollars, lock them up here with me at the central bank. In exchange, I will give you financial returns that are mathematically impossible to achieve through legitimate economic activity." The scheme operated something like this. First, the central bank lent enormous amounts of Lebanese lira to the commercial banks at a super low interest rate, let's say 2%. Second, the commercial banks took that borrowed lira and converted it into US dollars at the official 1,500 rate, then deposited those freshly converted dollars right back into the central bank. Third, the central bank then paid the commercial banks a massive interest rate on those dollar deposits they had just received, sometimes allowing the banks to instantly book profits of 40% or more on the transaction. Wait, what? If you're feeling confused right now, that's entirely the point. This was a circular motion of money specifically designed to create phantom profits that didn't actually exist. Let me give you an analogy to make this clearer. Imagine I lend you $10. You immediately use that exact same $10 to purchase a glass of lemonade from me. I then record in my accounting books that I successfully sold a lemonade and earned revenue. You record in your accounting books that you now own an asset, specifically the lemonade. On paper, we both look richer than we were before, but in reality, no new money actually entered the room. No new wealth was created. We just passed the same $10 bill back and forth between us and wrote down large numbers in our ledgers to create an illusion of profit. The commercial banks recorded massive immediate profits from these engineering swap transactions. They posted record-breaking earnings in 2016 and 2017. The bank CEOs awarded themselves huge bonuses, The shareholders received fat dividend payments. Everyone in the banking sector was celebrating. But the central bank was taking on massive future debt obligations. They were making promises to pay back these banks in US dollars that they didn't actually have, with interest payments they had no way to earn through legitimate economic activity. To keep this complicated machine running, the commercial banks needed an ever-increasing supply of fresh US dollars to feed the beast. So they turned to you, the ordinary depositor. They started aggressively cold-calling Lebanese expatriates around the world. Hey, come move your life savings to Beirut. We'll give you 12% interest on US dollar deposits, 15% if you agree to lock it in for 3 years. This is the absolute textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. They desperately needed new depositor money to pay the interest obligations on the old deposits and to continue lending to the government, which was burning through cash. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, looked at this situation and quietly panicked behind closed doors. In their official reports, they politely described the central bank's balance sheet as complex. In the world of international finance speak, when experts call something complex, what they really mean is that it's complete garbage and potentially fraudulent. By 2018, the exposure had become absolutely lethal. The commercial banks had taken roughly 70% of all the deposits in the entire country and parked them at the central bank. Think carefully about the concentration of risk this created. In a normal, healthy bank, they spread risk by lending money to thousands of different borrowers. A mortgage loan for Alice to buy a house, a business loan for Bob to expand his bakery, a car loan for Charlie to buy a vehicle. If Bob's bakery fails and he defaults on his loan, the bank survives just fine because Alice and Charlie are still making their payments. Risk is diversified. In Lebanon, the banks took virtually all the depositor money and lent it to just one single borrower, the state, via the central bank. If the state fails, if the central bank fails, then everything fails simultaneously. The banks collapse, the depositors lose everything, the currency implodes, the entire system goes to zero. The financial system had now become a massive, precarious tower of blocks in a game of Jenga. It was swaying dangerously. It just needed one gentle push to collapse entirely. And that push didn't come from a war. It didn't come from a foreign invasion or military conflict. It came from a $6 monthly fee on a smartphone app. 3. October 17th, the House of Cards collapses. If you want to truly understand how a civilization collapses, don't stare at stock market ticker displays or economic charts. Look at the trees burning in the forests. October 2019, just days before the entire economy died, the mountains of Lebanon were burning out of control. Massive wildfires tore through the Shuf region, consuming everything in their path. Ancient pine forests that had stood for centuries turned to ash and smoke. The Lebanese people watched helplessly as their natural heritage burned to the ground. And what did the government do to fight these fires? Nothing. Actually, they did worse than nothing. It was revealed that the state owned 3 specialized firefighting helicopters, Sikorsky models that had been donated to Lebanon years earlier, specifically for fighting forest fires. But they were grounded, sitting uselessly in hangars. Why? Because the government hadn't bothered to allocate money to pay for their routine maintenance. The helicopters couldn't fly. While the country literally burned, the politicians were bickering over pizza slices of power and patronage. The rage building in the air was thick enough to choke on. The heat was both literal from the fires and metaphorical from the public anger. That Jenga tower we discussed earlier was swaying violently, about to collapse. Then came Thursday, October 17th, 2019. The cabinet, desperate for any source of revenue to feed the Ponzi scheme and pay government salaries, announced a new brilliant idea, a stroke of genius in their minds. They decided they would impose a tax on voice over IP, or VoIP calls. They wanted to charge 20 cents per day, which works out to roughly $6 per month, for calls made using WhatsApp, FaceTime, and Facebook Messenger. Now, to an outsider looking in, this probably sounds trivial and harmless. A $6 tax, that's the price of 2 cups of coffee. Why would such a small tax start a revolution? Because in Lebanon, WhatsApp isn't just another app on your phone. It's an absolute lifeline for survival. It's how poor people communicate with their families without paying the exorbitant rates charged by the state-owned telecommunications monopoly. It's how the diaspora scattered around the world talks to their mothers back home. It was the only thing that was genuinely free in a country where citizens paid twice for electricity, once to the useless state grid, and again to the local generator owner, and twice for water, once to the state, and again to the private water truck. That $6 tax was a clear signal that the government was literally reaching into the pockets of the poorest, most vulnerable people to pay for their own incompetence, corruption, and waste. It was the spark that fell into a room filled with gasoline fumes. By that same evening, the streets of Beirut were on fire. But this time, it wasn't trees burning, it was tires. Thousands of people poured into the streets, then hundreds of thousands. Eventually, millions of Lebanese from across the entire country were protesting. From Tripoli in the far north to Tyre in the deep south, people marched. Something remarkable happened. The traditional sectarian lines that normally divide Lebanese society completely vanished. Christians, Sunnis, Shias, Druze, they were all chanting the exact same slogan together, Kilun Yani Kilum, which translates to, up, all of them means all of them. They were demanding the fall of the entire regime, the resignation of the government, and the end of the systematic corruption. It was beautiful to witness. It was terrifying for the establishment. It was the October 17th revolution. But while the cameras and journalists focused on the burning tires and the massive chanting crowds, the real disaster was happening quietly behind the marble facades of the banks, away from public view. The banks panicked completely. They saw the enormous crowds in the streets. They saw the political instability threatening the system. And they knew a secret that the general public didn't know yet. The vaults were empty. The US dollars were gone. They had been lent to the central bank, which had burned through them, trying desperately to defend the currency peg for years. So the Association of Banks in Lebanon made a decision that sealed the country's fate forever. They closed the doors. For 2 full weeks, the banks simply didn't open. ATM machines went dark and stopped dispensing cash. Online transfers were completely frozen. The entire banking system shut down. Imagine this scenario. You have $50,000 in your checking account. You worked hard for that money. You earned it. It belongs to you legally. The bank closes temporarily for security reasons due to the protests. You think to yourself, okay, things are chaotic in the streets right now. They'll reopen soon once things calm down. 2 weeks pass. November 2019 arrives. The banks finally reopen the doors. You rush to your local branch to withdraw some cash, maybe $1,000, just to be safe and have cash on hand. You get to the counter. The bank teller looks at you with sad eyes and says, "Sir, I'm sorry, but the withdrawal limit is $200 per week." "Excuse me?" You respond in shock. "It's my money. I deposited it here." "I understand completely, sir, but there's a new policy. $200 per week maximum. Take it or leave it." Panic sets in. Your heart starts racing. You try to transfer your money abroad electronically, maybe to a cousin living in France who can hold it safely. "Sorry, sir, but international transfers are suspended indefinitely." You try to use your credit card to make an online purchase. "Sorry, sir, but the international spending limit is now $50 total." This was the precise moment when the Ponzi scheme was officially and publicly revealed to everyone. The liquidity had vanished. The banks were completely insolvent, bankrupt. They had implemented what are called capital controls, which are restrictions on moving money. But here's the critical detail. They didn't implement these controls through a law passed democratically by parliament. This wasn't legal or official. These were de facto capital controls, meaning in practice, but not in law. It was illegal, completely arbitrary, and applied unilaterally by the banks themselves to protect their own survival without any legal authority. While you were fighting and arguing just to access $200 of your own money at the counter, reports started leaking out that the politically exposed persons, meaning the politicians themselves, the bank owners, and the well-connected elite, were transferring billions of dollars out of the country during those exact 2 weeks when the banks were officially closed to the public. The banks were closed for you, but the elite got their money out safely. You got trapped inside the burning building. And then the most terrifying thing of all happened. The exchange rate peg broke after 22 years. For more than 2 decades, one US dollar had been worth exactly 1,500 Lebanese lira. In November 2019, on the black market where people desperately traded currency, it suddenly hit 1,600 lira. Then it jumped to 1,800. Then it crossed 2,000. The ghost of hyperinflation had entered the room and would not leave. The economic miracle was dead and buried. The Switzerland of the Middle East had just transformed into a hostage situation. And the currency was about to take a nosedive that would make economic history books for generations. But before the currency hit absolute rock bottom, the depositors would have to learn a new word. A word that sounds cute, but represents the theft of a lifetime. The word is Lollar. 4. Enter the Lollar. The Great Haircut. Welcome to the most twisted magic trick in modern financial history. In 2020, a Lebanese financial analyst and former banker named Dan Azi coined a term that would become the defining word of the entire crisis. He combined Lebanese lira and US dollar to create a portmanteau, the Lollar. Here's the situation you find yourself in. You're still that person with $200,000 sitting in your bank account. You log into your mobile banking app or check online. The screen displays balance, $200,000 USD. It looks like US dollars. It smells like US dollars. The screen says USD clearly, but try to actually spend it. You can't transfer it to a bank in New York. You can't use your debit card to pay for a Netflix subscription. You can't even withdraw it as physical green $100 bills. Those aren't US dollars anymore. They're Lollars. They're essentially monopoly money. Digital points displayed on a screen that the banks absolutely refuse to honor as real dollars. Suddenly, Lebanon had two completely different currencies that shared the exact same name. First, fresh dollars. These are actual US banknotes physically brought into the country after October 2019. If you walked into a bank carrying a suitcase full of cash that you brought from London, that was considered fresh. You could deposit it and withdraw it again. It was real money with real value. Second, Lollars. This was your life savings, your retirement fund, the money you deposited before October 2019. It was trapped forever in the digital prison of the banking system, with no escape. So how do you get your money out if you desperately need it? The central bank, led by our friend the magician Salameh, introduced a mechanism that was pure evil disguised as genius. They allowed you to withdraw your dollars, but only by converting them first into Lebanese lira. And here's the vicious catch. They forced you to convert at a completely fake artificial exchange rate that bore no relationship to reality. Let's walk through the mathematics. Let's say the real black market exchange rate, meaning the true value of the currency on the street, where people actually trade, was 10,000 lira to $1. But the bank tells you with a straight face, we will let you withdraw your dollars, but we will calculate the conversion at a rate of 3,900 lira to the dollar. So you desperately need cash. You ask to withdraw $1,000 from your account to buy food and medicine. The bank hands you 3.9 million lira in cash. You take that brick of 3.9 million lira to the black market currency exchange on the street to convert it into actual dollars you can use. The money changer counts it and hands you back $390 in real US bills. Do you see what just happened? You withdrew $1,000 from your account, but you walked home with only $390 in real purchasing power. The other $610, poof, gone, vaporized into thin air. This was what economists politely call a haircut. Usually when a country goes bankrupt, like Cyprus did in 2013 or Greece during their crisis, the government passes an actual law through the democratic process. They announce publicly, we're very sorry everyone, but we're taking 10% of all deposits above a certain threshold to save the financial system. It's painful and people get angry, but at least it's transparent, legal, and applies equally to everyone. In Lebanon, there was no law. There was no vote in parliament. There was no public announcement or democratic process. It was a shadow haircut, an invisible theft. It was a daily, slow-motion robbery happening every single time a depositor desperately needed money to buy food or pay rent. They were forced to withdraw their Lollars and a catastrophic loss. Early in the crisis, the haircut was around 30%. Then it became 50%. Then it climbed to 70%. By 2023, the haircut on Lollar withdrawals had reached upwards of 85 to 90%. Imagine this emotionally. You work for 40 years to save a retirement nest egg, and then you're told you can only access that money if you agree to watch 90% of it burn before your eyes. But here's the absolute darkest part of this scheme. While you were weeping over your lost life savings, the banks were actually celebrating behind closed doors. Why? Because mathematically, your deposit represents a liability on the bank's balance sheet. It's money they owe you, a debt. By forcing you to withdraw your $1,000 as the equivalent of only $100 worth of purchasing power in worthless lira, they were wiping their debts off the books for pennies on the dollar. They were literally liquidating their insolvency by systematically incinerating the savings of the middle class. They were Lollarifying their liabilities. It's the perfect crime because there are no fingerprints. No one signed a document saying, we are confiscating your money. The market did it. Inflation did it. No one is responsible. And what about the truly wealthy, the ultra-rich elite? They didn't have to deal with Lollars at all. They had either moved their money out of the country before the crash started, thanks to insider information and advance warnings, or they used their political connections and power to force banks to transfer their funds abroad, even after the doors officially closed to regular people. Wait, it actually gets worse. I know I keep saying that, but it genuinely does. People became absolutely desperate to get rid of their Lollars before they lost even more value. A bizarre secondary market for checks emerged. Here's how it worked. Let's say you wanted to buy a luxury apartment in Beirut. The seller has a $1 million loan he owes to a bank. You have $1 million stuck as Lollars that you can't access. You write the seller a check for $1 million from your Lollar account. He gives you the keys to the apartment. He takes your check to the bank to pay off his $1 million loan. The bank accepts the check at face value, 1-to-1, to close out the loan on their books. Suddenly, real estate prices denominated in Lollars skyrocketed to absurd levels. A mediocre apartment was selling for $800,000 because people were just desperately trying to dump their fake digital money into anything tangible and physical that holds value. It became a frenzy of panic buying. People were purchasing Rolex watches, land, cars, jewelry, anything they could find to get rid of the numbers displayed on their banking app screens. By the summer of 2020, the Lebanese middle class had been effectively and completely wiped out. The doctors, the engineers, the university professors, the people who were supposed to be the backbone of the Switzerland of the Middle East, were now technically bankrupt on paper. The country was on its knees, barely breathing. The economy had become a zombie, dead, but still shambling forward. The people were physically and emotionally exhausted from the trauma. And then, just when everyone thought they had finally hit rock bottom, and things couldn't possibly get worse, something happened on a warm Tuesday afternoon. It was August 4th, 2020. The clock struck 6:07 p.m. 5, August 4th, the apocalyptic accelerator. You're sitting in your apartment in the neighborhood of Mar Mikhail or Genmaiza in Beirut. Maybe you're pouring yourself a drink after a long day. Maybe you're on a Zoom video call for work. It's 6:07 p.m. On August 4th, 2020, first you hear a deep roar, like a fighter jet flying far too low over the city. Then you hear a crackling sound, like fireworks exploding inside your skull. You walk toward the window to look in the direction of the port to see what's happening. And then your entire world ends in an instant. A shockwave traveling at supersonic speed punches through the city like an invisible fist from God. It rips the entire facade off your apartment building. It transforms your windows into a shotgun blast of thousands of glass shards flying at lethal velocity. It lifts cars off the highway and tosses them through the air like children's toys. In a tiny fraction of a second, the capital city of Beirut was disemboweled and gutted. Over 200 people died instantly. 7,000 more were wounded, many critically. 300,000 people, imagine the entire population of a city like Pittsburgh or Newcastle, were left homeless in the blink of an eye, their homes destroyed. This was the Beirut Port explosion, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in all of recorded human history. But this isn't a video about the explosion itself and the typical details. This is a video about the economy. And you might be asking yourself, how does this relate to the Ponzi scheme we've been discussing? It relates directly because the explosion wasn't a random accident or an act of God. It was the direct result of the exact same gross negligence, systematic corruption, and kick the can down the road mentality that destroyed the banking sector. For 6 full years, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which is a highly explosive chemical compound used in fertilizer and bombs, sat stored in Hangar 12 at the Beirut Port. Everyone in positions of authority knew it was sitting there. The port officials knew, the security agencies knew, the judges knew, the prime minister knew, the president knew. They all knew about this ticking time bomb, and they did absolutely nothing about it for 6 years. Why? Because in the Lebanese political system, actually doing your job requires taking responsibility, and taking responsibility is a political risk that might anger your patrons or expose corruption. So they simply let a ticking nuclear bomb sit next to the beating heart of the city until it finally detonated. The economic impact of the explosion was the final nail hammered into the coffin of Lebanon. The port was the lungs of the country, the way Lebanon breathed economically. Lebanon imports 80% of everything it consumes: food, medicine, raw materials, fuel. It all came through those docks at the port. The massive blast destroyed the port's operational capacity almost entirely. It vaporized the national grain silos, which held 85% of the country's strategic grain reserves for food security. So now you have a bankrupt country with no US dollars to purchase food imports, no functioning port to receive shipments even if you could buy them, and no silos to store grain even if it arrived. The World Bank estimated the direct physical damage at approximately $4 billion, with total economic losses reaching up to an additional $3.5 billion. In a normal functioning country, insurance companies would cover this disaster. But remember, the banking system is clinically dead. The insurance companies were exposed to the banks and held their reserves in the banking system. The local insurance sector was completely paralyzed. Most people who lost their homes and businesses didn't receive a single penny in compensation. They had to rebuild their shattered homes and shops using fresh US dollars they had hidden under the mattresses or received from relatives abroad. But the apocalypse didn't stop with the physical explosion. It just changed forms and mutated. It turned into darkness, literal darkness. If the banks were the diseased heart of the corruption, the electricity sector was the black hole sucking in money. For decades, the state electricity company Électricité du Liban, or ADL, has been an absolute disaster in money pit. It loses approximately $1.5 to $2 billion every single year. Here's a fun fact. Nearly 40% of Lebanon's entire accumulated sovereign debt exists solely due to borrowing money to keep the lights on. And yet, even before the financial crisis hit, the power went out for 3 to 12 hours every single day. After the port explosion and the financial crash, the government ran completely out of US dollars to purchase fuel for the power generation plants. The lights went out across the country, and they stayed out. By 2021, the state was providing only 1 to 2 hours of electricity per day to most areas. Sometimes it provided 0 hours. Imagine trying to live your life with only 1 hour of electrical power each day. Your refrigerator warms up and the food inside spoils. You can't charge your mobile phone reliably. There's no air conditioning during the blistering hot Mediterranean summer. Hospitals were operating on backup diesel generators, with doctors praying the fuel wouldn't run out in the middle of surgery. To survive this nightmare, the Lebanese people became hostages to what's known as the generator mafia. Neighborhoods are controlled by private generator owners, often politically connected thugs and criminals, who run loud diesel engines on street corners. They charge exorbitant rates in fresh US dollars just to provide a few hours of power. So, you pay taxes to the state for electricity you never receive, and then you pay a subscription fee to a local cartel lord just to run a fan and a single light bulb in your home. Then came the queues of humiliation at gas stations. The central bank, running dangerously low on foreign reserves, started lifting subsidies on fuel prices. Suddenly, gasoline became scarce and hard to find. People would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, drive to a gas station, and wait in line for 6, 7, 8 hours just for a chance to fill their tank. Fights broke out in these lines with knives and guns over a single gallon of gasoline. People were literally killing each other over fuel. I want you to picture this scene clearly. A medical doctor, who just finished a grueling 24-hour shift treating COVID patients in a hospital with no air conditioning, is now sleeping in his car in a gas station queue, just so he can get enough fuel to drive to work the next day to save more lives. This was daily life in Lebanon in 2021. The Switzerland of the Middle East had become a scene pulled straight from a Mad Max post-apocalyptic movie. The port explosion destroyed the infrastructure. The financial crisis destroyed people's life savings. The fuel crisis destroyed human dignity and hope. But amidst all this comprehensive destruction, a new bizarre economy began to emerge from the ashes. A shadow economy. A zombie economy where banks effectively don't exist, where cash is the only king that matters, and where money laundering isn't a crime anymore, it's the dominant business model. 6. The zombie economy. If you walk through the upscale districts of Beirut today, neighborhoods like Badaro or the coastal town of Batroun, you might notice something extremely strange and contradictory. The restaurants are absolutely packed with diners. The valet parking lots are overflowing with Range Rovers and luxury SUVs. The nightclubs are thumping with music until 4 o'clock in the morning. You might look at this scene and think to yourself, wait a minute, didn't you just tell me the entire country collapsed? Didn't you say people are fighting over bread and fuel? Yes, both statements are completely true simultaneously. Welcome to the zombie economy, a bizarre parallel reality. When the banking sector died, it didn't just disappear into nothing. It was replaced by something far more primitive and far more dangerous. The pure cash economy. Lebanon has effectively traveled backwards in time to the Middle Ages economically, but everyone has iPhones. Since absolutely nobody trusts the banks anymore, nobody uses them for anything important. Credit cards are useless pieces of plastic that don't work. Checks are historical artifacts that nobody accepts. Cash is king. And I don't mean carrying a few bills in your wallet. I mean carrying backpacks stuffed full of cash to make basic purchases. Let's examine the logistics of this absurd situation. The largest banknote in Lebanon is the 100,000 lira bill. Back in 2019, that single bill was worth $66. You could buy a nice dinner at a restaurant with it. Today, that exact same 1,000 lira bill is worth roughly $1, maybe a bit less. So imagine you go out to dinner with friends at a restaurant. The bill comes to $150. To pay that bill in Lebanese lira, you need approximately 13.5 million lira in cash. To physically carry 13.5 million lira, you literally need a brick of cash the size of a Harry Potter hardcover book. Restaurants had to go out and purchase industrial money counting machines, the kind you see in drug cartel movies, just to process the lunch rush and count the mountains of cash. Eventually, the absurdity became too much to sustain. In 2023, the government finally surrendered to reality. They officially dollarized the economy in practice. Supermarkets started displaying prices in US dollars again. Restaurants printed new menus showing prices in dollars. Now when you walk into a grocery store, the price tag says $5. If you have fresh dollars, meaning real US currency, you simply pay $5. If you only have Lebanese lira, you have to pull out a calculator or smartphone. Check the daily black market exchange rate on an app because it changes constantly. Do the mathematics, and then hand over a massive pile of rapidly degrading paper money. This shift created a terrifying two-tier society that exists simultaneously in the same country. Tier 1 is the fresh dollar class. This includes anyone who receives payment in US dollars from abroad. Remote software engineers working for American companies, people with generous relatives living in Detroit or Dubai who send money. And let's be completely honest, political cronies and money launderers. For these people, Lebanon is actually a paradise, an incredibly cheap place to live well. Services are dirt cheap. A haircut costs $3. A taxi ride across the entire city costs $2. You can hire a full-time maid for a few $100s a month. They live like kings and queens on a fraction of what they would spend living in Europe or America. Tier 2 is the Lira class. This is the vast majority of the population. Public sector employees, soldiers serving in the army, teachers, police officers, their salaries are still paid in lira, and those salaries haven't been adjusted to keep up with inflation. A soldier who used to earn the equivalent of $800 per month now effectively earns $50 per month in real purchasing power. A general in the Lebanese army, a senior military commander, earns less than a freelance graphic designer working from home. Think carefully about the national security implications of that situation. When your army is hungry and can't feed their families, who ultimately pays for their loyalty? With the banks effectively dead and non-functional, a new financial system had to emerge to move money around the country. Enter the money transfer operators, specifically companies like OMT and Western Union. These aren't just services for wiring money to grandmother anymore. They have become the de facto central bank of Lebanon, the actual financial system. In 2022, nearly $6.4 billion flowed into Lebanon through these remittance services. That represents approximately 30% of the country's entire GDP. The diaspora scattered around the world is essentially keeping the country on life support, like a patient in intensive care. Every month, the fresh money arrives through these services, gets converted into lira at the money changers on the street, and keeps the zombie economy stumbling forward for another month. But a cash-based economy has a very dark side that encourages crime. Money laundering becomes incredibly easy. When everyone pays for everything in physical cash, there is no paper trail, no electronic records, no audits, no compliance checks. If you want to launder drug trafficking money, evade international sanctions, or hide corruption proceeds, Lebanon has now become the perfect washing machine. You can purchase a $2 million penthouse apartment in cash, no questions asked. You can buy a fleet of luxury cars in cash. Nobody asks where the money came from. The international community noticed this problem. The Financial Action Task Force, known as FATF, which is the global money laundering watchdog organization, threatened to put Lebanon on its gray list. Being gray listed is basically financial quarantine. It makes it even harder for the country to do legitimate business with the outside world. But the Lebanese elite didn't seem to care about the threat at all. Why? Because the shadow economy actually benefits them enormously. It allows them to operate outside the scrutiny and oversight of Western financial systems. And yet, in the middle of this entire dystopian nightmare, the Lebanese people did what they always do throughout history. They adapted and survived. Remember the electricity crisis? The darkness covering the country? Well, look at a satellite image of Beirut today. Or just walk down any street and look all of the solar panels that surprised me from mind. I adored the top. Since the government couldn't and wouldn't provide electrical power, the people simply built their own independent grid. In a massive, decentralized, chaotic boom, households and businesses installed thousands of megawatts of solar power capacity across the country. Lebanon, quite by accident and necessity, became a regional leader in renewable energy adoption. Not because politicians care about climate change or polar bears, but because ordinary people needed to run their refrigerators to keep food from spoiling. It's a perfect metaphor for the entire country. The state is completely absent and useless. The infrastructure is broken beyond repair, so the people just build a workaround, adapt, and move on with their lives. But don't let the solar panels and the packed nightclubs fool you into thinking this is a recovery or success story. This is not a recovery. This is a mass hallucination, a collective delusion. A country cannot run on cash, remittances from abroad, and diesel generators forever. The education system is collapsing as teachers flee abroad. The healthcare system is bleeding doctors and nurses who are emigrating to find better opportunities. The infrastructure is rotting and crumbling. The zombie economy is just the corpse of Lebanon being animated by foreign dollars, walking blindly toward a cliff edge. And at the bottom of that cliff lies the end game. Because eventually the International Monetary Fund comes knocking on the door, and the bill for 30 years of partying finally comes due. 7. Endgame. The future of the Phoenix. So where does this tragic story end? Usually in a financial crisis movie, this is the dramatic part where the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, swoops in like the Avengers superhero team. They slam a briefcase full of cash on the table, force the government to fire all the corrupt officials, pass strict reform laws, and slowly but surely the country rebuilds itself. That almost happened in Lebanon. In April 2022, the Lebanese government and the IMF signed what's called the staff-level agreement. The IMF promised $3 billion in immediate aid, which would unlock billions more in additional funding from other international donors. It seemed like a lifeline, but there was a catch, and it was a big one. The IMF isn't stupid. They've seen this movie before in other countries. They said to Lebanon, "We will give you this money, but only if you do 3 specific things first. First, audit the central bank completely. Find out exactly where all the money went and who is responsible. Second, pass a capital control law through parliament. Make it illegal for the rich and powerful to continue smuggling money out of the country. Third, restructure the commercial banks properly. Admit publicly that they are bankrupt and wipe out the shareholders who profited from the fraud." The Lebanese politicians looked at this list of requirements carefully. They looked at the $3 billion in aid being offered, and they essentially said, "No thanks, we're good." Why would they refuse desperately needed aid? Because doing those 3 things would expose them personally. An honest audit would reveal exactly who stole the money and where it went. Restructuring the banks would wipe out their own personal investments, since many politicians literally own stakes in the banks. Passing capital control laws would prevent them from continuing to move their own money abroad. So they chose option B instead. Option B is what international experts call the shadow plan. It is perhaps the most cynical, brutal economic strategy imaginable. The plan is devastatingly simple. Do absolutely nothing. Just let time pass. Let inflation run completely wild. Let the lira crash into oblivion. Why? Because inflation acts like a giant eraser that makes debts disappear. Remember that roughly $100 billion in debt the government owed to the banks, and the banks owed to depositors like you? If you allow the currency to lose 98% of its value through hyperinflation, that debt effectively disappears from the books. It becomes meaningless. They are liquidating and erasing the financial losses of the state by systematically incinerating the life savings of ordinary people. They are lollifying all the liabilities away. It's the perfect crime because there are no fingerprints. No one signed an official document saying we are confiscating your wealth. The market did it. Nobody is legally responsible. And what about the villains of our story, the people responsible? Well, here's an interesting twist to the tale. The magician, Riad Salameh, finally left his position as central bank governor in July 2023 after an astonishing 30 years in power. For a while after leaving office, he sat comfortably in his luxury villa, smoking his expensive cigars. seemingly untouchable. Meanwhile, European courts in France and Germany issued arrest warrants against him. They seized millions of dollars in assets he had hidden abroad, luxury apartments in Paris, office buildings in London, bank accounts across Europe. Then, in September 2024, something happened that shocked everyone who had been following the story. Riad Salameh was arrested in Beirut by Lebanese authorities. He was finally in handcuffs. Is this justice finally being served? Maybe. Or maybe it's just the system cynically throwing one man under the bus to save all the rest. Because remember this crucial point, Salameh didn't act alone in a vacuum. He printed the money and ran the schemes. True, but the government spent that money. The parliament approved the budgets and borrowing. The commercial banks enabled every step. The entire political class was complicit. Putting one wizard in handcuffs doesn't undo the spell he cast over the country. It doesn't bring back the $70 billion that vanished. Today, Lebanon remains stuck in a kind of limbo, suspended between life and death. It is a land of beautiful contradictions that don't make logical sense. You can ski in the mountains in the morning and swim in the warm Mediterranean Sea in the afternoon, all in the same day. You can eat some of the best food in the entire world, served by people with genuinely the warmest hearts you'll ever meet. But you will experience all of this in a country where the central state has essentially ceased to exist as a functional entity. The phoenix isn't rising from the ashes this time like it did before. It's evolving into something different and darker. Lebanon is slowly becoming a confederation of tribes and sects, a feudal system. If you get sick, you don't go to a state hospital because they barely function. You go to your political party's private clinic. If you need a job, you don't apply online or through merit. You ask your sect's political leader for a favor. The central state is dissolved away, leaving behind a medieval feudal system where warlords and sectarian leaders provide tiny crumbs of survival services in exchange for total, unquestioning loyalty. It is a tragedy of truly epic proportions, a textbook lesson in what happens when you allow corruption to rot the foundation of a house for 30 consecutive years. Eventually, the roof doesn't just start leaking, the entire structure collapses violently on your head, burying you in the rubble. So what is the real unvarnished truth about Lebanon's economy and what happened? It wasn't a mistake or accident. It wasn't bad luck or unfortunate timing. It wasn't simply geopolitics or external forces beyond anyone's control. It was a mathematically inevitable collapse, carefully engineered over decades by a cartel of bankers and political warlords who treated a sovereign nation like their personal ATM machine. They sold ordinary people a beautiful dream of stability, symbolized by the currency peg, all while they systematically looted the vault from the back door, filling their own pockets. They weaponized the famous resilience of the Lebanese people against them. They knew the people would adapt to any hardship, would buy solar panels when the grid failed, would get money from the cousins working in Brazil. They counted on and exploited that legendary resilience, so they would never have to actually fix a single thing. And that's perhaps the scariest part of this entire story, because if this catastrophe can happen in the so-called Switzerland of the Middle East, with its Ivy League-educated bankers and glitzy nightlife and sophisticated culture, it can genuinely happen anywhere in the world where debt is treated as income and corruption is treated as normal policy. The moral of this story is brutally simple. If your government tells you that your currency is perfectly stable and secure, but they absolutely refuse to show you the actual reserves backing it up, run away immediately. If your bank offers you interest rates that are double or triple the global average with no clear explanation, run away fast. And if the men in positions of power have been ruling for 30 years straight and claim that only they can save you from disaster, run the fastest you possibly can. Lebanon will survive this catastrophe somehow. The people are too strong, too intelligent, too resourceful, and too alive to simply disappear from history. But the money, the accumulated savings of an entire generation of hardworking people, that wealth is gone forever. It will never come back. An entire generation's dreams turn to smoke.